Daniel Ashworth had taught 5th grade at Whitmore Elementary for 11 years, and in all that time, Friday afternoons had become something sacred to him, a quiet ritual nobody else understood. While the rest of the building emptied out by 4 o'clock, the hallways falling silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of a janitor's cart, Daniel stayed behind in room 3B with a single student, a boy named Wesley Calloway, who struggled with reading in a way that made the other children's patience wear thin and made Wesley himself go quiet and small in his chair. Daniel had noticed him in September, the way Wesley's eyes would drop to his desk whenever it was his turn to read aloud, the way his shoulders would curl inward as if he could disappear into his own sweater. By October, Daniel had asked him to stay after school on Fridays, just the two of them. No pressure, no grades, just sounding out words together, over graham crackers and milk, cartons from the cafeteria. Wesley had been hesitant at first, suspicious almost, as if kindness were a trick he hadn't learned to recognize yet. But slowly, week by week, he began to loosen. He started making jokes. He started asking Daniel questions about his own childhood, whether he'd been a good reader, whether he'd ever been embarrassed in front of the class. Daniel always answered honestly, because he understood that trust with a 10-year-old wasn't built through grand gestures but through small, repeated proof that someone was choosing to show up. It was mid-November, the Friday before Thanksgiving break, when Daniel first saw her. He was walking Wesley to the front doors after their session, the boy's backpack slung over one shoulder, chattering about a video game he wanted for Christmas, when Daniel glanced through the tall windows of the front office and saw a woman standing across the street. She wasn't near the parent pickup line, wasn't under the awning where the buses idled, but out past the fence line, near the old bus stop bench that nobody used anymore, her arms wrapped around herself against the wind. She wore a thin gray coat, the kind that looked like it belonged to a milder season, and she stood so still that at first, Daniel thought she might be waiting for someone else entirely. A neighbor, a friend, anyone but them. But when Wesley stepped outside and lifted his hand in a small wave, the woman's whole posture changed, softened, and she smiled the kind of smile that seemed to cost her something to hold on to. Daniel realized, watching them walk toward each other, that this was Wesley's mother. He had met her once at back-to-school night briefly, a tired handshake and an apologetic smile about having to leave early for a shift. Her name was Margaret, though Wesley called her Meg, and she worked, Daniel remembered vaguely, somewhere on the other side of town. He didn't think much of it that first Friday. Parents waited outside schools all the time, and perhaps her car had broken down, or perhaps she simply preferred the walk. But the following Friday she was there again, in the same spot, the same thin coat, arms crossed against a wind that had grown sharper with December's arrival. And the Friday after that, Daniel began to notice details he hadn't let himself notice before. She never sat on the bench, even though it was right beside her, as though sitting might mean staying too long, admitting to a weight she didn't want anyone to measure. She never came closer to the building, never stood beneath the awning with the other parents who arrived early, even though it would have sheltered her from the wind. She kept her distance, patient and silent, until Wesley appeared, and only then did her whole body seem to exhale. By the second week of December, Daniel found he couldn't stop thinking about it. It nagged at him during his lunch breaks, distracted him while grading spelling tests, sat with him quietly during the long drive home. Something about the picture didn't fit together the way an ordinary explanation should. If she had no car, there would be other days she needed pickup too, not only Fridays. If she worked nearby, she would wait in the warmth of her own vehicle, not stand exposed against a bench in a coat unfit for the season. He found himself, without quite deciding to, watching for her through the window each Friday as their tutoring session wound down, watching the way she checked her phone, tucked her hands beneath her arms, shifted her weight from foot to foot to keep the blood moving. The Friday before winter break, curiosity outweighed his hesitation. After Wesley darted out the door calling his usual goodbye, Daniel stepped outside himself, ostensibly to check the mail slot by the entrance, but really just to close the distance enough to speak. Margaret saw him coming and straightened, the way people do when caught in a private moment, and Daniel, not wanting to embarrass her, simply said that he was glad to have caught her, that he wanted to update her on how well Wesley was doing, how much progress he'd made since September. It was true, and it gave them both something safe to stand inside. She thanked him, her voice threadbare with cold, and told him Wesley talked about their Friday sessions constantly, that he'd started reading bedtime stories out loud at home instead of asking her to read them to him. Daniel felt something warm loosen in his chest at that, the particular reward of watching a child unlearn shame. But even as they spoke, he noticed her shivering, noticed the redness climbing her knuckles, and he asked as gently as he knew how, why she waited outside instead of in her car. There was a pause long enough that Daniel almost regretted asking. Then Margaret told him, quietly, without self-pity, that she didn't have a car anymore. She'd sold it in October when the transmission failed and the repair cost more than the car was worth, and she couldn't afford both the repair and rent that month. She walked to her shift at the diner on 5th Street each morning, and she walked back to meet Wesley each afternoon at the elementary school 2 miles from the diner, timing her break so she could be there for pickup on the days their apartment sitter couldn't manage it. Fridays were the only day her shift ended early enough to make the walk herself, so she always came, rain or wind or cold, because she refused to let Wesley be the last kid standing at the curb wondering if anyone was coming. Daniel asked why she didn't wait inside, in the front office where it was warm, and this was the part of her answer that stayed with him longest. She said she didn't want the school staff, or worse, Wesley's classmates, to see her waiting there day after day in a coat that had seen better winters. Didn't want anyone connecting the dots the way people sometimes did. Didn't want Wesley to sense, even faintly, that his mother had nothing left to spend on a proper coat, that they'd stretched every dollar thin enough to nearly see through it. She said Wesley didn't know how tight things had become since the transmission died, and she intended to keep it that way as long as she possibly could. Standing at that bench out past the fence line was simply easier to explain away than sitting in a warm office where someone might ask questions she didn't have comfortable answers for. Daniel didn't say much in response, because there wasn't a version of comfort that wouldn't have felt hollow in that moment. He told her only that he understood, and that Wesley was lucky to have someone who'd walk 2 miles in the cold rather than let him feel alone at a curb. But he thought about her the entire drive home, and the thought didn't leave him over the following days. He thought about the bench, the thin coat, the pride wrapped around her like a second layer against the wind. The following Monday, Daniel spoke quietly with the school's front office staff and with the district's family resource coordinator, a woman named Louise who handled situations exactly like this one with more grace than paperwork usually allowed. Together they found a way to connect Margaret with a community fund the district kept for families facing sudden hardship. Money meant for exactly this kind of gap. A broken transmission, a missed month of rent, the invisible math that families do when a single expense threatens to topple everything else. Daniel didn't do this to be thanked. He did it because he'd spent 3 months watching a woman stand in the cold to protect her son from worry, and he understood that the kindest thing he could offer wasn't sympathy, but action taken quietly without announcement, so that her dignity stayed exactly where she'd fought to keep it. By January, Margaret had a car again, a modest one, secondhand and a little rattly on cold mornings, but reliable enough to make the drive instead of the walk. She still came to pick up every Friday, but now she waited in the warmth of the driver's seat, and sometimes when Daniel walked Wesley out, she would roll down her window just to say a quick thank you, though she never elaborated on what exactly she was thanking him for, and he never asked her to. Wesley's reading continued to improve through the winter, steadily, the kind of progress that comes from consistency rather than miracles. By spring, he was volunteering to read aloud in class, his voice growing steadier every week, and Daniel would sometimes catch Margaret's eye at school events, a small nod passing between them, an understanding that needed no further words. He never told anyone the full story, not even Louise, beyond the barest facts necessary to unlock the fund. Some kindnesses, he'd come to believe, were meant to stay small and unspoken, meant to matter only to the people who lived inside them. Years later, when Wesley graduated from Whitmore Elementary and moved on to middle school, Margaret sent Daniel a card. A simple one, no elaborate message, just a single line that read, "Thank you for seeing what I tried so hard to hide." Daniel kept that card in his desk drawer through every year that followed, tucked beneath a stack of report cards and lesson plans, a small reminder of why he still stayed late every Friday, long after Wesley had moved on, ready in case some other child needed a quiet hour and a familiar face, and ready in case some other parent stood waiting in the cold, hoping nobody would notice the sacrifice it took just to be there.